In this part of our conference, we talk about DEI excellence, starting with what might just be the most intuitive of questions. What does it mean? Speaking of excellence, if you don't know our guests, our next guests, you probably don't know enough about DEI just yet. Jennifer Brown, welcome to DNI Changemakers 24.
Thank you for having me.
It's fantastic to have you with us. If I were to start, because we want to look at the transition in DEI and the changing landscape around DEI excellence, can we start with your attempt at a definition of DEI excellence? What is it? And please imagine you're talking to a somewhat skeptical audience. Let's make it a little bit more challenging.
Thank you. It is often a skeptical audience, but in a nutshell, what I believe DNI endeavors to do is create a workplace where all of us can thrive, and a workplace which takes into account how we have experienced that workplace previously, historically, in our identities and in our cultures and other aspects of who we are. And it assumes, and this is based in data, that the workplace has not been built by and for everyone to thrive. It has not worked as well for some as it does for others. And yet we've been treating people the same. We've been expecting the same level of performance when there are fewer mentors or sponsors or role models or support, and where there are biases, unconscious and conscious biases that permeate most organizations. So the idea of DEI is to create that workplace, to perfect it, to improve it, to make it a place of belonging, because the belief is, and the data shows this, that performance increases when belonging is present and when it is strong. And so what we teach is we teach leaders and managers how to create that kind of environment, how to think about it, how to be aware of their own biases, and how to really see what each person needs in the organization and not ignore differences that make a difference.
Which fundamentally, when you think about it, is really sometimes as simple as intuitive as do as you would be done by. Quite,
Oh, I love
quite
that.
naturally.
Yes.
What are the most important changes in DI now? Are we talking about organic growth, organic change, or are we talking about any major shifts in this landscape?
We are talking about, I think, really big changes. Certainly, so in the US environment, the political headwinds that the field faces are increasing, and I expect will continue, which is going to force the field to be very innovative. But around the world, I actually think that change is reality for so many leaders and organizations, and just humans in general. So everything is changing about our world. Generational differences, the way younger talent wants to be engaged, and the relationship that they want with their employer is changing. And they certainly, as a generation, want to bring more of their full selves to the workplace, which is an opportunity to learn and grow, and for the institution to change and accelerate in the change. So all around the world, I see that there's a waking up to the way that talent can do their best work and the kind of environment that needs to exist to facilitate that. So it just depends, I think, around the world, which part of the world we're talking about, because the political landscape does impact, particularly I can say in the US, that does impact the role of companies in advocating for their employees and making sure that regardless of or in spite of whatever is the political headwinds or how legislation changes and laws change and protections change, that the role of the company is to, I think, be very much in the forefront driving progress towards a multicultural future. And any company and any leader that denies that the world is changing and becoming more multicultural, becoming more multi-identity, both the workforce and customers around the world. Those leaders and companies, I don't think will thrive. They won't be able to pivot, and they won't be able to meet the future effectively. So we have a lot of reasons to pay attention to the fundamentals of D&I and to embed them in our business now, because we will need them for the future.
Hard to disagree about any of that, Jennifer. When you think about it, DEI conversation is largely around empathy, tolerance, acceptance, understanding the needs of others. So it would be, in a way, ironic that those things can even depend on politics, cultural milieu, so to say, in that sense. But do you see any other massive challenges other than politics, what you've just mentioned in the context of the US elections, other than politics for companies and their effort to push this effort forward?
Definitely. I mean, we've been struggling. I've been in the work 20 years, so a lot of my challenges have remained the same. It's buy-in from the top of every institution, which continues to be the biggest factor relating to whether or not a company moves forward on this topic. And that, I think, is partially generational. The generation who are in leadership positions is by nature an older generation with having grown up in a different time and having perhaps less comfort or knowledge about how the world is changing and how to lead a multicultural workforce, and truly how to actually engage beyond their generation. Have those conversations, establish that trust, present an exciting vision that's inclusive. I think that there are generational beliefs and biases to certain that are held by certain generations about the worthiness of this. And companies, to me, can progress and then fall back. The same company, depending on the leader and depending on what they believe, how they visibly they lead, how much they maintain the conviction, and how much they understand how the business needs to change to thrive in that multicultural world. So that's always been true. And you ask anyone who does this work, and we all answer, how is the leadership at the top? So that is, I think, independent of the political environment, because it comes down to usually the person and what they believe personally, and what kind of leader they want to be, and what kind of legacy they want to have, and also their grasp on how their own business is changing and how their workforce is changing, how their customers are changing. And so, the faith in the principles of D&I can come from a lot of different places: personal, the business, what we call the business case, right? The data and what it shows you about the future. I would argue it's all of those things. It's taking into account the moral question of empathy and doing right and being fair and being equitable, and what that really means, which is not treating everyone the same and expecting everyone to feel a sense of belonging, but that we need to see and acknowledge differences and acknowledge the workplace that has had flaws, and has actually created exclusionary dynamics over the many years of the modern workplace. But these leaders that I'm thinking of, ideally, they are asking all these questions. They are leading, and often they're leading without a lot of answers too. This is not something that can be answered factually. We certainly have a lot of data, but
They
leadership is
not
an
only don't
intangible.
have they not only don't have those answers, but they even refuse to actually want those answers in the first place. We're living in a world where authoritarian leadership is becoming a thing again, I suppose. You mentioned the word biases and bias at least twice in our conversation so far. So I want to ask you about resistance, because biases, one thing about them is they tend to run deep. They are not easily overcome. They are, as you mentioned, very personal to people. So I suppose part of the conversation is, on the one hand, resistance, and on the other hand, creating a language where you can overcome this resistance, become a lot more relatable when explaining things that to you and me may feel very obvious and very natural. Empathy is a thing that you cannot really undermine. And yet, you need to adjust the language to the actual audience whose mind you want to change. So the big question is, what approaches are effective in overcoming resistance, Jennifer?
Well,
Really
I think
effective.
we are, yeah, we have a lot of resistance, unfortunately. I think people think D&I is about things that it's not, first of all. Unfortunately, it's been the unfortunate result of being targeted in the way that it has been is that the terms have been redefined and redefined incorrectly. Um, the work is about inclusion, care, belonging, community, things that you would say we can't argue with. And yet it has been painted as divisive. And unfortunately, it's been so effective that many people think this work is against them, that it takes something away from them, that it threatens their position or their job security or their really their way of life. So when you think about resistance, it's a deep, you talk about a deep resistance. People will protect that and they will fight for it. But the problem is, to me, is that the definitions are not correct. So they're fighting against something that has been defined not by me and not by, I think, our field, but as what's been presented in the media. So it's very unfortunate. And I don't actually know how to get around that. You know, we're all talking about, do we need to use different language and call it something new? And I mean, yes, maybe, but somehow we have to get back to, I think, how everyone benefits from the principles of DNI. Somehow need to retake that narrative, redefine, um, interest people again, have them see that this is actually an opportunity for everyone to transform through empathy, through really seeing and hearing others, and really leading others as a result of the trust that we can build, which we're not going to build that trust if people don't feel seen, heard, valued, respected, acknowledged. It's just not going to happen. So but so that's the resistance. And then awareness of bias, of course, is okay, if we're human, we're biased. We all have an instinctual biases that are deep. But what matters to me is you can't eradicate the bias. I don't believe you can actually get rid of them. You can, though, develop the practice of seeing them, witnessing them, noticing it, and then making different choices as a result. I think the problem lies in the unexplored bias. It's the bias that we don't know we hold, that hurts and harms people around us and their sense of self and confidence. And then we have cultures of fear in organizations where I think feedback is really difficult to give, particularly what we call upwards feedback, to say so that that leader can learn where their biases are having a negative effect. We are afraid to have those conversations; they're difficult conversations to have. But often, I don't know if it can be all work that we do alone. We have to understand our impact, and someone has to have the courage to say, "I don't think you mean that. There's a better way. Do we know why this is happening? Can we change it?" That's what I would like to see. And that means, you know, courageous humility on the part of leaders everywhere to say, I don't know the answers and I'm flawed just like everybody else. And I want to get better. And that's all we can really say. I understand my limitations and I want to get better. Let's do that together.
Sounds perfectly easy on paper, but as we all know, in the world where there's so much stigmatization going on, uh, attempts to categorize everything around woke and call it that name or any other, not an easy thing to address in a world we live in, apparently. How do you measure real progress? Because obviously a sense of progress is always a good thing to have. So what would be the most effective way if we could address that briefly, because we've already run out of time, unfortunately.
Oh my goodness. Well,
Time
the
flies.
letters, I know, time flies. The letters matter. So diversity is the who, and it's visible and invisible differences. And so as companies get more sophisticated, we are counting not just race, gender, ethnicity, but other identities, neurodiversity, things that are not visible, sexual orientation, gender identity. I'm starting to really encourage caregiving, mental health, a lot of the things that impact the workplace are, to me, diversity dimensions worth tracking. So, progress would be that people feel comfortable disclosing because they know that the organization is supportive and that it's a conversation that they will not be penalized for having. And then inclusion is the measurement of the how, it's the measurement of how people lead and how you embrace that diversity. How do you enable that diversity to create and innovate? And to me, that is measured through 360-degree feedback, through engagement surveys that we look at the data by business function, by leader, so that we can see what sort of climate they're creating. So the inclusion is the climate and the how, and then the diversity to me is the resulting demographic change that we want to see in our workforce so that it reflects the world that we do business in. That's what we want. Today, it doesn't reflect, particularly senior leadership levels don't reflect the world that we do business in. So that's the problem. But we need to, in order to change one, we need to change the other, and they really go together very importantly. They depend on each other, and you cannot have one without the other.
I couldn't agree more. Jennifer, over the years, given your huge and very diverse experience in the field, you have also developed specific diagnostic tools to help companies understand themselves better to start with before they really know how to prioritize what they should do first and next. Do we want to give the name of this tool and send our audience right there? It's a free tool, apparently.
Yes, yes. We have something called the inclusiveleaderassessment.com. It's really easy to remember. And it's a quick 10-minute assessment, and you'll get a report with resources, things to listen to, things to read, and a score. And the score points to the inclusive leader continuum that is from my latest book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader. And it's a 4-phase growth model. And I think it's so important to know where you are. In order to take the right next step, it's important to diagnose, what am I comfortable with? What do I not know? Where am I not active and proactive? Why am I holding back? So my work is so much about allowing people to see where they are and encouraging them from wherever they are to progress, to take that next step. But this is not a destination, it's a journey, and it's sometimes forward and sometimes backwards because that's how we learn. And it's not always easy to develop a new habit of leadership, but it will encourage you, I think, to understand how to make incremental progress and build that muscle so that you can be that inclusive leader that the future will need.
Jennifer, we are oceans apart, but fortunately only in the geographic sense. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.